The Meridian's windows caught the last pink of Los Angeles sunset, and for a moment Margot Sinclair looked like she belonged in that light, silk robe, bare feet, a laugh that sounded newly unburdened. Julian St. James watched from the doorway of the apartment they no longer shared, holding the final signed copies as if paper could be heavier than the years they'd lost. Her phone buzzed on the marble counter, and the screen flashed an email preview. 3 words that didn't fit the calm. Archer footage. Tonight. Margot's smile never cracked. She only turned the phone face down with a tenderness that felt rehearsed, then kissed Julian's cheek like they were acquaintances at a fundraiser. 2 days after the divorce, Julian told himself he was free. 2 days after the divorce, an email meant for someone else landed in his inbox and rearranged every memory he thought he owned. If stories like this leave a mark on you, the quiet kind that lingers, stay with me. The Meridian looked the way Julian St. James had always wanted his life to look. High, clean, expensive, and beyond the reach of street noise. Los Angeles spread out beneath the glass like a story someone else had written. Inside the living room, the air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and the last bouquet Margot had refused to throw away. The divorce papers lay on the marble island in 2 identical stacks. Monica Walsh had arranged them with the same careful symmetry she used in court. Nothing accidental, nothing emotional unless it served a purpose. Julian's pen hovered over the signature line as if the ink had weight. Margot stood by the window, her silhouette cut from the sunset. She wore a cream blouse tucked into black trousers, not morning black but something close. Her hair was pinned back in a way that made her face look younger, almost newly single. She watched the city without watching it, the way she'd watched him for the last year. Present, absent, impeccable. "You're sure you understand the morality clause?" Monica said quietly, her voice more warning than instruction. "If anything surfaces that suggests misconduct on your side, Julian, it becomes ammunition. Custody isn't just about love. It's about optics." Julian nodded, though his throat had gone tight. The clause had seemed like an insurance policy when he signed it years ago, an empire's version of romance. Now it felt like a trap he'd helped build. Margot turned from the window. Her smile arrived on time, practiced and gentle, like a hostess greeting donors. "We're done torturing each other," she said. "Let's sign. Let's be decent." Decent. The word landed wrong. Julian had built a company on the promise of decency. Privacy, safety, discretion. But decency in a marriage was supposed to be messy, human. It was not supposed to look like Margot's face, calm enough to make his anger feel childish. He signed. The pen scratched across paper, and the sound seemed too loud in a room full of expensive quiet. Monica collected the pages, flipped, aligned, slid them toward Margot. Margot didn't hesitate. She signed with the same handwriting she used on gallery guestbooks. Graceful, unbroken, as if no part of her had ever trembled. Julian watched her hands. No ring. She'd removed it months ago, quietly, without ceremony, like turning off a lamp in a room no one used anymore. His own ring felt suddenly hot on his finger. He wanted to take it off, too. He wanted the skin beneath it to breathe. Margot's phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit briefly, casting a cold reflection on the marble. Julian wasn't trying to look, but the preview caught his eye the way headlights caught animals on dark roads. Subject: Archer footage. Tonight. Margot's fingers moved fast, too fast for casual. She turned the phone face down with a softness that looked almost like affection. Julian's relief, his private, shameful relief, shifted into something else. Not jealousy, not even rage. Something colder, the sense that the story he'd agreed to tell the world might not be the real one. "I'm glad you're happy," he heard himself say, and hated how small it sounded. Margot met his gaze, and for a moment the calm slipped. Not enough to show pain, just enough to show effort. "I'm glad you are too," she said. "You deserve peace." The lie wasn't in the words. It was in the way she offered them, like a gift she'd already paid for. Monica cleared her throat. "I'll file today," she said, standing. "Julian, I'll call you tonight about the Brighton prep schedule." Margot walked Monica to the door. When she returned, she stopped close enough that Julian could smell her perfume. Something clean, expensive, almost clinical. She kissed his cheek, brief and careful, as if he were a colleague. "Take care," she whispered. Then she picked up her phone, and the face-down screen felt like a closed eye. Julian stood in the quiet of the Meridian, papers signed, future rearranged, and realized he had never been more afraid of what he didn't know. Underscore 2 nights after the filing. The beacon's rooftop made loneliness look like luxury. Heat lamps glowed like small suns, and the city's lights below looked forgiving, soft enough to hide what they cost. Jessica Kim leaned on the rail beside Julian, her hair lifting in the wind. She worked media, always had, and her friendship came with the gift of brutal honesty wrapped in charm. "So," she said, watching him the way she watched trending scandals, "how does it feel to be single again?" Julian lifted his drink, the ice clinking too brightly. "Quiet," he said, "like taking off a suit that didn't fit anymore." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "You're trying to convince yourself." He almost laughed. "Maybe, but she was happy. You saw her at the hearing." "I saw her perform," Jessica corrected. "Margot doesn't do happy unless she's decided it's useful." Julian flinched at the word useful. He'd spent his whole life admiring Margot's control, until it turned into distance. The bartender slid a fresh napkin under Julian's glass, as if the world existed to prevent stains. Julian turned slightly, scanning the crowd out of habit. St. James hotels had taught him to read rooms, where trouble gathered, where secrets hid, where eyes lingered too long. That was when he saw him. Derek Stone stood near the far corner, close to the private cabanas, dressed in charcoal and confidence. He wasn't famous in the obvious way. No bodyguards, no screaming fans, but he had the kind of face that belonged in gossip photos. Clean jaw, steady gaze, a smile that didn't ask permission. Julian had seen that smile in his mind too many times. Derek looked up as if he'd felt Julian's attention like warmth. Their eyes met across the rooftop, and Derek's expression softened. Not with guilt, but with something nearer to recognition. Jessica noticed Julian's stillness. "Don't," she said under her breath, following his line of sight. "Julian, don't do it." Julian didn't move. The air around him tightened, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Derek started walking toward them, unhurried. People stepped aside naturally, not because he forced them, but because his certainty made space. By the time he reached Julian, the rooftop noise had blurred into a distant wash. "Julian," Derek said, voice low. He spoke Julian's name like they'd met before, like this was a continuation, not an introduction. Julian's hand tightened around his glass. "Derek." A small smile. "I'm sorry," Derek said, and the apology sounded like a line he'd practiced in a mirror. "For everything." Jessica's gaze flicked between them like a camera lens. "You should go," she told Derek, crisp and polite, "before this becomes a thing." Derek didn't look at her. "It's already a thing," he said softly. Then he met Julian's eyes again. "You don't know what you think you know." Julian's pulse jumped, angry and alive. "What does that mean?" Derek's phone vibrated. He checked it quickly, his smile fading for the first time. Something like fear flashed across his face. Gone so fast it could have been Julian's imagination. Derek stepped back. "Just be careful," he said. "There are people who want you angry. It makes you predictable." Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by laughter and music and a night that pretended it didn't collect receipts. Julian stood frozen, drink sweating in his hand, and realized his freedom felt less like peace and more like the calm before something broke. Underscore from L. N. Unknown to Brian Cooper. Subject Re. Hold the narrative. Julian read the header 3 times before his mind accepted it. He sat alone in his temporary rental, sterile, staged, smelling faintly of new paint. His phone lay on the coffee table like a small bomb. The email had arrived at 6:12 a.m., likely meant for the security chief of St. James Hotels, but somehow routed to Julian's personal address. 1 digit off, 1 mistake, 1 crack in a system built on precision. He opened the attachments with a dread that felt like déjà vu. There were keycard logs from the Archer Hotel. Entries, timestamps, door numbers. The pattern was neat, too neat like a schedule. There were screenshots of texts between 2 contacts labeled M and D. M. Tonight has to look real. No improvising. D. I'm not an actor. M. You're being paid like one. Remember the kid. Julian's mouth went dry at the word kid. The next file was a memo typed, unemotional. A fair narrative is holding. Continue until settlement clears. Avoid Brighton prep cameras. Do not use St. James Valet. Julian stared at the lines until they blurred. Settlement. Narrative. Avoid cameras. This wasn't the language of love. It was the language of crisis management. His first thought was insultingly simple. Margot was worse than I imagined. She hadn't just cheated. She'd orchestrated it like a campaign. But then Derek's warning at the beacon surfaced, sharp as broken glass. You don't know what you think you know. Julian scrolled, hands numb, until he found the final attachment. A photo taken from behind. A woman, Margot, walking a hotel hallway. A man beside her, head angled toward hers as if whispering. The Archer's carpet was patterned in muted gold. The lighting was soft, designed to flatter. And yet the photo felt ugly because it wasn't intimate. It was composed, framed, as if someone had chosen the angle. Julian's ring lay on the counter where he'd left it the night before, finally removed. The pale circle of skin beneath it looked like evidence. He forwarded the email to a separate address, then froze with his finger hovering over Monica's name. If he called her, it became legal. Court filings, motions, custody battles. Headlines with the words hotel heir and cheating wife sewn together. If he didn't call her, he became a man sneaking through his own life, hunting for the truth like it was a thief. He remembered Margot turning her phone face down, not hiding like a guilty person, hiding like someone protecting a fragile thing from light. Julian stood, pacing the narrow living room. The city outside was waking. Garbage trucks, distant sirens, the hum of a world that didn't care about his marriage. He opened his laptop and logged into the St. James security portal, something he rarely did directly. A founder's privilege, a husband's impulse. The Archer logs matched the attachments, which meant the email wasn't fake. Julian felt anger rise, but beneath it was something stranger. The sensation of being managed, like a guest in his own hotel, guided gently toward the view someone wanted him to see. His phone buzzed. A text from Monica. Monica. Brighton Prep called. We need to talk today. Julian stared at the message and understood the email's final instruction wasn't a suggestion. Avoid Brighton Prep cameras. Something was already moving, and his child was somewhere inside it. Veronica Walsh's office smelled like espresso and old paper. Comforting lies. Her windows faced downtown, but the blinds were angled to prevent anyone outside from reading the room. Monica believed in privacy the way Julian believed in architecture, as something you could design. Julian sat opposite her, shoulders tight, the missent email printed and clipped like evidence. Monica read in silence, her face giving away nothing until the end. Then she exhaled, slow. This, she said, tapping the memo, is either the dumbest affair I've ever seen or something else entirely. Julian's jaw clenched. It looks like coordination. It looks like strategy, Monica corrected. And strategy always has a target. Julian leaned forward. Brighton Prep called you? Monica slid her phone across the desk. An email from the school's administration. A parent had complained about inappropriate content circulating among families. No names. No attachments. Just the gentle threat of scandal. They don't do this unless it's already in their group chats, Monica said. And those parents love a story, especially one with money. Julian's skin went cold. What content? Monica's gaze sharpened. I don't know yet, but I can guess. Julian pictured a grainy hotel hallway photo, Margot's back, Derek's shadow. He pictured parents whispering while their children played tag. He pictured his child hearing a cruel word and not understanding why it hurt. Monica flipped to the prenup clause, the part Julian had always avoided rereading. Here's the problem, she said, voice steady. The morality clause isn't just financial. It's custodial leverage. If evidence emerges that you were negligent, ignored harmful exposure, failed to protect your child's environment, the court can see it as instability. Julian's throat tightened. But Monica held up a hand. Margot's alleged misconduct matters, yes. But don't miss the real angle. Someone can destroy you as a father without ever proving you were a bad man. They just have to make you look careless. The word careless stung. Julian had built St. James hotels on the promise that nothing careless happened under his roof. He stared at the printed email again at the line, "Continue until settlement clears." Why now? He asked, quieter. Why would she stage, if she did stage? Anything after the divorce is already filed. Monica's expression softened, almost sympathetic. Because filing is not the finish line. It's the start of public narrative. Margot knows that better than anyone. Julian thought of Margot at donor galas, her smile perfect under flashbulbs. He'd always admired her ability to make people feel safe while revealing nothing. Should I call her? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Monica's voice went firm. Not yet. If you confront her without understanding the full picture, you become a reaction. And reactions are easy to manipulate. Julian stood, restless. So what do I do? Monica handed him a card with a number written in her neat handwriting. Brian Cooper, she said. St. James Security. He owes me a favor. He can quietly check whether there's actual footage. Where it's stored. Who accessed it. Julian stared at the name. It connected to the missent email like a lock meeting a key. And Julian, Monica added, her voice dropping, do not, under any circumstances, let your child see the worst of this first through someone else's phone. Julian left the office with the card in his pocket and the sense that his divorce wasn't a closure. It was a door someone had propped open. Margot's new place was smaller than the Meridian but more expensive in a different way, tasteful scarcity. The walls were mostly bare, as if she hadn't decided what version of herself would live there. A single painting leaned against the living room wall, still unhung. A dark ocean under a pale sky. Julian knocked once, then again. When Margot opened the door, she looked unsurprised, as if she'd heard him arriving long before his knuckles touched wood. You shouldn't be here, she said softly. That's not a no, Julian replied, stepping in before she could decide otherwise. Her apartment smelled like bergamot and something metallic, like coins. Her phone sat on the counter, face down again, a habit that now looked like a confession. Julian didn't waste time. He placed the printed email on the counter between them. Explain this. Margot's eyes lowered to the pages. She didn't touch them. She didn't flinch. She only inhaled, slow, and Julian realized he'd come hoping to catch her in a human moment. Panic, guilt, anger. Anything that proved she was as messy as he felt. Instead, she gave him control. You got that how? She asked. It was sent to me, Julian snapped. By accident. Or on purpose. I don't know anymore. Margot's mouth tightened. Just slightly. A crack. Julian leaned closer. Were you coordinating it? The hotel logs. The texts. Hold the narrative. That isn't love. That's strategy. Margot finished, voice quiet. Julian froze. So you admit it. Margot met his gaze. Her eyes were steady, but there was exhaustion behind them, deep and private. I admit you don't understand what you're holding, she said. The calmness in her voice was not the calm of innocence. It was the calm of someone carrying something heavy for a long time. Julian's anger surged, a familiar refuge. "I divorced you because you were unfaithful," he said, each word sharp. "Because you made our home into a lie." Margot's eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward a closed door. His child's room, when their child stayed here. A protective reflex. "You divorced me because you wanted relief," she said, and her honesty cut deeper than any insult. "Because you were tired. Because the story fit what you already feared." Julian's throat tightened. "Don't turn this into my fault." Margot's voice softened. "I'm not. I'm telling you the truth you don't want. You were ready to believe the worst of me because it made your pain simpler." He hated that she was right. He hated that simplicity had felt like mercy. Julian tapped the line on the memo. "Brighton Prep," he said. "Why is our kid in this? Why does it say to avoid cameras?" Margot's face changed then. Just a shadow passing over it. But it was enough. Fear. "Who's doing this?" Julian pressed. Margot looked away. Her gaze landed on the ocean painting, unframed, like a horizon she couldn't reach. "You should go," she whispered. "No," Julian said. "Not this time. Not with our child in the middle. If you're paying someone. If you're staging, if Derek is." Margot's eyes snapped back to his. "Don't say his name here." Julian stared, stunned by the sharpness. "Why?" Margot's hands clenched at her sides. "Because walls listen," she said, voice low. "Because people pay to hear what we think is private." Julian felt the room tilt. "Margot?" She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint tremor in her throat as she swallowed. "If you want to protect our child," she said, "you will stop chasing your pride and start asking who benefits from your anger." Julian's phone buzzed, Brian Cooper, returning his call. Margot glanced at the screen and her expression tightened, as if a countdown had begun. Julian answered, eyes never leaving her. "Talk." Brian's voice came through, clipped and urgent. "Julian, someone accessed Archer security archives last night. Not our staff. And it wasn't random. They searched your name." Julian's blood turned cold. Margot closed her eyes for one brief second, the way people did before impact. So the Archer Hotel had been designed to feel like a secret you paid to keep. Its lobby lighting made everyone look like they belonged, even if they didn't. Julian walked through it with his collar up, baseball cap low. An absurd disguise for a man whose name was engraved on half the city's philanthropic plaques. Brian Cooper met him near the service corridor. A thick-shouldered man with the eyes of someone who never stopped scanning. "We have blind spots," Brian said without preamble, leading Julian away from cameras. "Every hotel does, but someone knew exactly where ours were." Julian's pulse hammered. "Show me." Brian's keycard opened a staff door. They entered a narrow hallway that smelled like carpet cleaner and hidden perfume. The farther they went, the more Julian's memory filled in gaps with imagination. Margot's back, Derek's hand, the staged softness of it all. They stopped outside room 1713. "The logs," Brian said, holding up his tablet. "This door. Multiple entries over 3 weeks. Same times. Same pattern. But here's the part that's wrong." Julian stared at the door number until it felt like a bruise. "What's wrong?" Brian tapped. "No minibar charges. No room service. No valet. No one stays in a hotel that many times and never leaves a trace unless they're not actually staying. Or they're careful," Julian muttered. Brian shook his head. "Careful people still eat." Julian swallowed. "Can we access footage?" Brian's expression tightened. "Not all of it. Archer's archive server was breached last night. Someone pulled clips from the hallway camera, not the lobby. And they did it with credentials that looked legitimate." Julian's stomach dropped. "Whose credentials?" Brian hesitated, then spoke carefully. "A contractor's account. Temporary. Like someone created it for this." Julian reached for the door handle, then stopped himself. The room was just a room. A number. A set. But in his mind it contained the entire failure of his marriage, packaged neatly for viewing. "You can open it," Brian offered, reading Julian's tension. "It's vacant. Cleaned." Julian exhaled.
No.
"Not yet." Brian studied him. "What are you thinking?" Julian's mind flashed to Monica's warning. Reactions are easy to manipulate. If Julian stormed into the room, he became a predictable headline. If he kept it quiet, he might be able to see who was watching. He turned to Brian. "Who else knows about the breach?" "Only me. And whoever did it." Julian nodded slowly. "Good. Keep it that way." Brian's brow furrowed. "Julian, this is beyond marital drama. If someone can breach Archer archives, they can ruin the company. They can—" "My child," Julian interrupted, voice low. "Brighton Prep is already hearing whispers." Brian's eyes hardened. "Then we need to move fast." Julian stared at room 1713 again. At the smooth door, the peephole like an unblinking eye. He imagined Margot here, walking in on schedule, performing betrayal so someone else could record it. And he realized with sudden, sick clarity. If the affair had been staged, the audience wasn't Julian. It was someone else. Someone who wanted proof. Someone who wanted leverage. Julian's phone buzzed. A message from Jessica. "Jessica. Something's circulating. Parents at Brighton Prep. Call me now." The hallway's air felt suddenly thin. Julian turned away from the door. "We're not chasing my marriage," he said to Brian. "We're chasing who bought it." Sir Brighton Prep looked like an institution that promised parents their children would never be surprised by life. The hedges were clipped, the sign freshly painted, the staff smiles calibrated to soothe wealth. Julian arrived early, sunglasses hiding the exhaustion he couldn't afford to display. He found their child, Eli, near the courtyard fountain, backpack too big for his shoulders, hair still damp from a rushed morning shower. Eli waved when he saw Julian, then hesitated, glancing sideways at a cluster of classmates. One boy whispered something, and the group laughed. Not loud, just enough to be heard. Julian's chest tightened. "Hey," he said, crouching. "Everything okay?" Eli shrugged too quickly. "Yeah, Dad?" Julian waited, letting silence make space. Eli's voice dropped. "Is Mom bad?" The word hit Julian like a punch to the throat. He forced his face to stay calm. "Why would you ask that?" Eli looked down at his shoes. Someone showed a video, not a real video, like a hallway, and they said Mom was with a guy. Julian's vision narrowed. "Who showed you that?" Eli shook his head. "I didn't watch. I just heard." Julian's hands curled into fists, hidden at his sides. The cruelty wasn't in the content. It was in the delivery, children learning adult judgment through screens. Julian stood and guided Eli toward the main office. A receptionist greeted him with an expression that tried to be warm but carried the faint frost of liability. "We'd like a word," Julian said, voice controlled. In a small conference room, the vice principal joined them, a woman with kind eyes and a spine made of policy. She spoke gently about digital boundaries and community standards, about how gossip could affect a child's environment. Julian heard the subtext. "Handle your mess." "I want to know where it came from," Julian said. "I want to know which parent circulated it." The vice principal sighed. "Mr. St. James, we can't police families' private communications." Julian leaned forward. "You can protect my child." Her gaze flicked to Eli's closed-off posture. "We are," she said softly. "But I need to be honest. If this escalates, if cameras show up, if there's public disruption, the board will demand action." Action. Another euphemism. Another way of saying your child may become collateral. Julian's phone buzzed. "Monica." He excused himself to the hallway, voice low. It reached Eli. Monica's silence on the other end was heavy. "Then it's already worse than we hoped." Julian swallowed. Brian says Archer archives were breached. Julian, Monica said, sharp now. Listen to me. If a blackmailer has footage, they can release it to ruin custody. They can make you look like you chose reputation over parenting. You need to document everything. You need to be proactive. Julian stared down the corridor where children's artwork lined the walls. Bright colors, simple truths. He'd thought divorce would reduce pain. Instead, it had given pain a new address. He looked back into the conference room. Margot wasn't there. She was a ghost in her child's school, judged in her absence. Julian's anger shifted, rearranging itself into something like resolve. He texted Margot. Julian, Eli heard it. I'm done with silence. We talked today. 3 dots appeared, then vanished. No reply. Julian turned his phone over in his hand, suddenly understanding Margot's habit of turning hers face down. Not shame, control, survival. Derek Stone called Julian from a blocked number. Julian almost didn't answer. The impulse to reject was strong, clean, satisfying. But clean satisfaction was how Julian had ended up divorced and still ignorant. Where are you? Julian demanded the moment the line connected. Derek's voice was strained. Not safe on the phone. Meet me at Sunrise Cafe. 10 minutes. Sunrise Cafe was the kind of place that pretended it wasn't in Los Angeles. Neighborhood quiet, mismatched chairs, sunlight too honest. Julian arrived first and chose a table near the back, his body tense with the anticipation of conflict. Derek slid into the seat opposite him, hoodie up, eyes shadowed. For the first time, he looked less like a villain and more like a man who hadn't slept in days. Julian didn't greet him. Start talking. Derek's throat bobbed. I wasn't your wife's lover. Julian let out a harsh laugh. Then what were you? A messenger, Derek said. A decoy. A face. Julian's hands tightened around his coffee cup until heat seeped into his skin. She paid you. Derek nodded once. Not how you think. Julian leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. Explain. Derek's eyes flicked around the cafe as if expecting someone to step out from behind the pastry case. Someone has footage, he said. From the Archer. They have enough to make it look real. And enough to ruin her. To ruin you. To ruin your custody. Julian's pulse slammed. Who? Derek shook his head. I don't know their name, but I know the terms. They demanded money monthly. If she didn't pay, they'd leak. If she fought, they'd escalate. Julian's mouth went dry. And the divorce? Derek hesitated. She thought if she became the villain publicly, you'd have custody leverage. She thought you'd be protected. Julian stared, stunned by the twisted logic. Protected by destroying herself. Derek flinched. She was trying to control where the blast landed. Julian's mind raced back through Margot's calm smile, her face-down phone, her refusal to deny or confess. Walls listen, she'd said. You're lying? Julian whispered. Not because he believed it, but because the truth was too expensive. Derek's eyes hardened. Ask her how long she's been paying. Ask her why the memo says, until settlement clears. Because the blackmailer doesn't care about your marriage. They care about your money and your name. Julian swallowed. Why come to me now? Derek's jaw tightened. Because they're done waiting. They want the final payment. And if they don't get it, it goes online. Tonight. Julian's stomach dropped. Tonight where? Derek slid a napkin across the table with a number written on it. Room 1713. The Archer. 11:30 p.m. Julian stared at the number. The same door he'd stood in front of like a man at his own grave. Derek's voice lowered. Margot's been doing this alone, he said. Because she didn't trust you not to turn it into vengeance. And because if you got involved, you'd become their bigger prize. Julian's chest tightened with something that wasn't forgiveness and wasn't hatred. It was the sick understanding of how far Margot had gone without him. He stood abruptly. If you're a decoy, he said, Then you know how they operate. Derek nodded once, fear flickering. Yeah. Good, Julian said. Because we're ending this tonight. Margot met Julian in a quiet corner of St. James Hotel's corporate tower, the Sterling building, after hours, when the elevators sounded like distant sighs. She wore a trench coat despite the heat, as if she needed armor. Brian Cooper stood nearby, arms crossed, face unreadable. Monica joined by speakerphone, her voice sharp and controlled, warning them all like a surgeon who hated watching amateurs hold scalpels. Margot didn't greet Julian with softness this time. Her eyes were tired, stripped of the performance. You spoke to Derek, she said. Julian didn't deny it. He told me about the payments. Margot's mouth tightened, and Julian saw the flash of anger she'd kept hidden. Not at Derek. At Julian, at his late arrival to a war she'd been fighting alone. You shouldn't have involved him, she said. Julian's voice stayed low. You shouldn't have involved our child. Margot's gaze snapped. I didn't. But you staged an affair, Julian shot back. You let the world and Eli believe you were. Margot flinched at Eli's name like it was a bruise. I did what I had to do, she said, voice rough. I chose the version of pain that I could manage. Brian cleared his throat. We don't have time, he said. If Derek's intel is right, the drop happens at 11:30. Archer, 1713. We can set a controlled perimeter. Quiet. No police. No sirens. Monica's voice cut in. If there's blackmail, we need evidence. Clear chain. Julian, you cannot put hands on anyone. Margot, you cannot be alone with the subject. Brian, you record everything. Julian watched Margot as Monica spoke. Margot's hands trembled slightly, just at the fingertips. She had been calm for months because she couldn't afford to break. Now, with the plan forming, her body betrayed her. Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice so Brian wouldn't hear. How long? He asked. Margot didn't pretend not to understand. Long enough, she said. Julian's chest tightened. How much? Margot's eyes shimmered. Not with tears, but with the threat of them. Enough that I stopped buying anything for myself, she whispered. Enough that I started lying to you because telling you would have made you react. Julian swallowed hard. You didn't trust me. Margot's gaze held his, steady and devastating. I didn't trust your rage, she said. Because rage is a luxury when you're being hunted. The word hunted made Julian's skin go cold. He looked at Brian. Can we isolate the hallway camera feed in real time? Brian nodded. We can mirror it. We can record. But whoever they are, they're smart. They chose Archer because it's half ours and half leased. Jurisdiction gets messy. It's a perfect place to make people feel alone. Margot exhaled shakily. That's why they chose Derek, she said, almost to herself. A story people already wanted. Julian's anger softened into something heavy. He realized the divorce had been a kind of anesthesia, temporary numbness over a wound that still existed. Monica's voice sharpened. Julian, you need to decide now. If the blackmailer demands you trade the footage for your child's privacy, what do you choose? Company reputation? Margot's reputation? Or the simplest truth? Your child's safety? Julian looked at Margot. Her eyes were wet now, but she didn't let the tears fall. She stood like someone waiting for a verdict. Julian's voice came out quieter than he expected. Eli, he said. Always. Margot's shoulders sagged, the smallest release. Good, she whispered. Then don't try to save me by destroying everything else. Julian stared at her, realizing the trap wasn't only for the blackmailer. It was also for them, forcing a choice between punishment and protection. At 10:45 p.m. they left together, not as husband and wife, as co-defendants in a story someone else had tried to write. Undersurf. The Archer's hallway lights were softer at night, flattering even fear. Julian stood behind a service door with Brian, watching the live feed on Brian's tablet. The camera angle showed the corridor, the patterned carpet, the door to 1713 like a promise. Margot waited down the hall, visible on screen, coat open now, hair loose to look more like the woman people wanted to believe existed. A wife slipping into sin. The performance was a weapon, and Julian hated that she could still wield it so well. Heart rate, Brian murmured. Julian's jaw tightened. Don't. Brian glanced at him, then back at the feed. He's late, Brian said. Or she's early. Julian watched Margot shift her weight, her gaze flicking once toward the ceiling corner where she knew a camera lived. She was signaling, I'm aware. I'm ready. Monica's voice came through Julian's earpiece. Crisp. Remember, we need him to speak. We need a demand on record. Julian's palms were damp. He felt like he was watching someone he loved walk toward a cliff with a smile. Footsteps appeared on the feed, shoes entering frame from the far end. A figure in a baseball cap, posture casual, carrying a slim envelope. Not Derek. Smaller. Moving like someone who didn't want to be remembered. Margot straightened. The figure stopped a few feet from her. On the feed, Julian couldn't see the face clearly, only the tilt of the head and the faint gleam of glasses. The person spoke, no audio from the hallway feed, only visuals. Margot's shoulders tightened. Her hands lifted slightly, palms out, negotiation posture. The figure extended the envelope. Margot didn't take it. Then the figure raised a phone. Julian's stomach dropped. The screen lit bright even through the camera, and Julian saw a paused video thumbnail. Margot in the hallway, Derek beside her, door 1713 behind them. A caption bubble above it, text too small to read, but the implication was clear. One click and it's everywhere. Margot's chin lifted. She said something. Julian imagined her voice calm, persuasive. She was good at calm. The figure shook their head. Then, with sudden efficiency, they stepped closer and pushed the phone toward Margot's face, like forcing her to witness her own manufactured shame. Julian's body surged forward instinctively. Brian caught his arm. Wait, he hissed. We need the audio. We need him to... Margot's hand moved fast. She grabbed the phone. The figure's posture changed instantly. A struggle, brief and sharp, like two people fighting over a knife. Julian broke. He burst through the service door into the hallway, footsteps loud in the hush. Stop, he shouted. Margot's eyes widened, shock, anger, fear. Everything she'd kept hidden. Julian, no. The figure jolted backward, then ran. Brian lunged after them, moving like a trained animal. Julian hesitated for half a second, torn between pursuit and Margot. In that half second, Margot's breath hitched, and he saw her face collapse into something raw. The terror of losing control. Julian chose her. He reached her, hands hovering without touching, as if afraid contact would break her. Are you okay? He asked, voice hoarse. Margot stared at him like he'd ruined something sacred. You weren't supposed to come out, she whispered. I couldn't watch, he said. I couldn't. Margot's eyes flashed with pain. That's the problem, she said. You think this is about what you can bear. Down the hall, a door opened. A curious guest peeked out, phone already lifted, ready to film. Brian's voice crackled over Julian's earpiece. He's in the stairwell, going down. I'm on him. Monica's voice followed, urgent. Julian, get Margot out. Now, if a guest films this, it's over. Julian took off his jacket and draped it over Margot's shoulders, blocking her face. He guided her toward the service exit, heart pounding. Behind them, the hallway camera kept recording, the same corridor, the same door, the same story trying to repeat itself. Only now, Julian realized, the narrative was no longer theirs to control. Under email transcript, forwarded from Brian Cooper to Julian St. James, Monica Walsh. Subject, Archer incident, ID and motive body. We caught the courier, not the architect, but we got the device. There's a shared drive link. The footage wasn't for tabloids first. It was for leverage. Julian read Brian's email in the dim light of the Sterling Building security office, long after midnight, while Margot sat across from him with a paper cup of water held between both hands. Her knuckles were white. Her trench coat remained on, as if she couldn't risk feeling warm. Brian entered with a small evidence bag. A phone? Its screen cracked at the corner from the hallway struggle. "We mirrored the device before it locked," Brian said, voice grim. "There's a folder. Dozens of clips. Not just Margot." Julian's stomach tightened. Not just her. Brian shook his head. Executives. Politicians. Guests who paid for privacy. Someone's been collecting compromised footage from our properties. Archers just where they got bold. Monica's voice came through speakerphone, controlled but sharp. "That's extortion. Organized." Julian looked at Margot. She stared at the water cup as if it might spill and drown her. "You knew," Julian said slowly. It wasn't a question. Margot's eyes lifted. In them, Julian saw something he hadn't let himself see in months. Fear that was not about losing a husband, but about losing a child. "I found out last year," Margot admitted, voice almost flat. "I saw a payment request on a hidden account tied to the Archer lease. I traced it. I thought it was a contractor scam. Then they sent a clip." Julian's throat went tight. "A clip of you?" Margot's mouth trembled, then steadied. "A clip of Eli," she whispered. Julian went still. The room seemed to shrink, air pulled from it. "What do you mean?" Margot swallowed hard. "A security camera angle near the pool. Eli was changing into swim trunks. It was innocent, but they framed it like it wasn't. They said," her voice broke, the first true break Julian had heard. She forced it back into place. "They said they could ruin us. They could make me look like a negligent mother, and you look like a man who protects an empire over his child." Julian's vision blurred with rage. "So you staged an affair?" Margot's eyes shone. "I staged a narrative," she corrected, voice raw. "Because they needed leverage on you, Julian. Your name, your company, your custody. If I became the villain, the court would lean toward you. If the scandal hit, it would hit me, not Eli. Not St. James Hotels." Julian stared, horrified by the logic and the love behind it. "You destroyed yourself to control the blast." Margot's shoulders rose and fell in a shaky breath. "I tried to," she whispered. "And it worked until they got greedy. Until they wanted the final payment after the divorce because they realized you were happy. You were moving on. They were losing control." Julian thought of his relief at the beacon, the drink sweating in his hand, the sense of freedom. He'd been celebrating while Margot had been bargaining with monsters. Monica's voice cut in, quieter now. "Margot, why not tell us? Why not tell Julian?" Margot's gaze flicked to Julian, and in it was a weary honesty that made him flinch. "Because he would have tried to fix it with anger," she said. "He would have confronted, threatened, and they would have released the Eli clip out of spite. They wanted him reactive. Derek told him that, didn't he?" Julian's jaw clenched. Derek's warning returned. "Anger makes you predictable." Brian set the evidence bag down. "There's more," he said. "The shared drive has a file labeled J. S. J. It isn't hotel footage. It's financial." Julian's blood went cold. "Financial?" Brian nodded. "Wire transfers. Shell vendors. Someone's been using Archer's lease structure to launder money through event invoices. And the blackmailer's been recording anyone who might notice. Anyone who might stop it." Julian realized then the affair narrative had never been about passion. It was camouflage, smoke poured into a marriage to hide a fire in an empire. Margot's voice dropped to a whisper. "I wasn't happy after the divorce," she said. "I was relieved you were safe, that you didn't see the worst of it, that Eli could still look at you like you were steady." Julian felt something inside him tear. Pride, certainty, the comfortable villain story he'd worn like armor. He looked at Margot across the table, and the tragedy sharpened into focus. They had loved each other in opposite directions, protecting in ways that felt like betrayal. Monica spoke softly now. "We can end this," she said. "But it will cost. Public exposure. Audits. Board fallout." Julian stared at the evidence bag, at the cracked phone, at the years of quiet manipulation. Then he looked at Margot. For the first time since the divorce, he reached across the table and covered her trembling hands with his. "We end it," he said, voice low. "But Eli never becomes their weapon again." Margot closed her eyes, and a single tear finally fell onto the paper cup. Silent, unphotographed, real. Los Angeles morning came indifferent. Sun spilling over glass towers like nothing had happened. In the Sterling Building's boardroom, the city looked clean from above. No fingerprints, no bruises. Julian stood at the head of the table with Monica beside him and Brian near the door. The board members sat in tailored silence, faces arranged in the familiar mask of concern that always preceded damage control. They had built St. James hotels into an empire of discretion, and now discretion had become the crime. Monica spoke first, precise, unromantic. She laid out the evidence. The laundered invoices, the compromised footage, the contractor accounts, the breach logs. She spoke in the language boards respected. Risk, liability, litigation, reputational exposure. Julian watched their expressions change. Shock, anger, calculation. No one asked about Margot. No one asked about Eli. Empires didn't ask about children until children became headlines. When it was Julian's turn, he didn't give them the comfort of a speech. He gave them one sentence. "We're cooperating fully," he said, "and we're burning every blind spot you ever told yourself was acceptable." A man at the far end, the kind who used to clap Julian on the back at charity galas, leaned forward. "Do you understand what this will do to the brand?" he asked quietly. Julian thought of Eli's voice. "Is Mom bad?" He held the board member's gaze. "I understand what it would do to my son if we didn't." The room fell silent, not from respect but from the cold recognition that Julian had chosen something inconvenient. By noon, lawyers were moving like ants through the building. Auditors arrived. A formal investigation launched. A controlled statement went out, carefully worded, legally sterile. The blackmailer's architect was not caught that day. Not fully. But the courier's device led them to a network, and once daylight hit it, the network started eating itself. People who thrived in secrecy panicked when forced into visibility. The scandal didn't vanish. It never did. It shifted shape, less about Margot's affair, more about a hospitality empire compromised. Still ugly, still loud. But the ugliest footage, the clip weaponized against Eli, never surfaced. Monica made sure of that. Brian made sure of that. Margot had already made sure of that for a year alone. That evening, Julian returned to the Meridian one last time, not because it was home, but because it was where the story had ended the first time. The apartment was emptier now. Margot's things were gone. The air smelled like quiet and expensive wood. Margot arrived a few minutes later, moving like someone who hadn't slept, but her posture was straighter than it had been in the security office. She looked at Julian as if they were standing on opposite shores. "I'm moving closer to Brighton Prep," she said softly. "So drop-offs are easier. So Eli doesn't feel split." Julian nodded. "Good." Margot swallowed. "The board will paint me as the distraction," she said. "The cheating wife. They'll keep using it, even if they know it wasn't real." Julian's throat tightened. "I know." Her eyes searched his face, vulnerable now in a way she'd refused to be during the divorce. "Do you hate me?" she asked. Julian wanted to say no. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to say something that fixed the shape of the pain. But the truth was more complicated, rawer. "I hated the story," he said quietly, "because it made me feel righteous. And righteousness is easier than grief." Margot's breath caught. "Julian." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding ring. The gold looked ordinary in his palm, small for all it had promised. He walked to the kitchen island, the same marble where the divorce papers had rested, and set the ring down gently. Not thrown, not dramatic, just placed like returning something borrowed. Margot stared at it, tears gathering again, but she didn't step forward. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Julian looked at the ring, then at her. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "It means we stop pretending the marriage can survive the way we survived," he said. "We co-parent. We tell Eli the truth in an age-appropriate way. We don't build our peace on a lie someone else can sell." Margot's face crumpled slightly, a private collapse. She nodded once, like accepting a verdict she'd feared and deserved. Julian moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle, the city's light pouring in from the windows behind him. He didn't turn back to rescue her with romance. He didn't punish her with cruelty. He gave her the only thing left that was clean. He said softly, to the ring on the marble and to the woman who had worn it beside him, "Leave the ring. Keep the truth." Julian walked out, and the apartment held its silence like a final, honest sentence.